So I think it's 5 minutes past the hour. We had around 60 plus registrations, so there might be still some people joining us while we are speaking. So we are now at around 32, 33, next one joining, 34. Yes, so welcome to this side session at the OECD Garment and Footwear Forum on due diligence, and the side session of the Standard Convergence Initiative, the SCI. We are going to have a presentation later on that is going to be presented by Anne Wilkins and Mathieu Lamole. The introduction will be done by
Christian. I think you've frozen.
We're losing you, Christian.
Well, I will. Hello, everybody. My name is Matthijs Critet. I'm moderating this session together with Christian. And Christian, if you can hear me, once your sound is back on, just cut in at any time. That is no problem. But in the interest of time, let me move to the next slide, if there is somebody who can actually move those slides. Otherwise, let's see. Yes. So, right, what are we going to do in this session? We are going to take a look at what the SCI is, why it has been developed, how it works. Not too long, because then we're going to go straight to the main part of this session, to look at the ITC Standards Map database and the exercise we did as SCI. So after that, we will have some discussion, and we'll tell you what the next steps are. Now, if we go to the next slide, let me explain a little bit about the SCI. This stands for Standards Convergence Initiative, and it's an initiative of the IAF, the International Apparel Federation, and the International Textile Manufacturers Federation, ITMF. So we joined together because both of our member groups were telling us that audit and standard fatigue was a major issue for garment and footwear and textile manufacturers. Let me define what we mean first by audit and standard fatigue. Actually, making that definition is already part of the work that we want to do as global organizations striving for global standards. We also need global definitions. So sometimes audit and standard fatigue are bunched together in the term audit fatigue. And this creates confusion. When we say audit fatigue, we mean that a manufacturer faces multiple audits measuring like the same social and environmental conditions in the company. So it can be one brand doing its own audit, then another brand coming in doing its own audit, a standard organization doing its own audit. They all collect the same data, but because they don't collaborate, they don't trust each other, they can't share that data. It leads to overlap in audits. Standard fatigue is when the company, the manufacturer, faces multiple standards, the ones from its clients, but importantly also the ones from those companies that are not its clients yet, that it would like to have as its clients, and that it would like to show that it's in compliance with their standard. But if the standards just slightly deviate, which often is the case, what do they prepare for? Standard A or standard B or standard C? So very often they have to make an exercise of what is the harshest, the most tough standard, and prepare themselves for that one so that they're prepared to take on multiple customers. And this is unnecessary. Now, the reduction of audit and standard fatigue, of course, then helps to reduce costs to the industry. But I think it's important to stress it's not just cost, it's not just hard dollars. It's also the uncertainty that is related to it for manufacturers. It's the dependency on whatever the next client is going to ask, and the fear that small changes or big changes have to be made very quickly because of diverging standards. This creates a lot of waste of resources. But of course, these systems of these standards weren't set up for nothing. So there must be a clear, trustworthy flow of information about the real state of the supply chain. So the quality and integrity is also important when you're looking at these systems. Next slide. So why has the SCI been developed? Well, too many duplicative and unnecessary audits, and of course, the corona pandemic highlighted the necessity to act, which is what we did. Therefore, the answer is to align standards. And because we are international federations, we always look at what global standards could we possibly reach. Fortunately, there are global standards that standard holders can actually connect to, and in that way, promoting and creating more convergence. There are oversight methodologies. There are the ILO fundamental conventions. There's compliance with national laws and regulations. There are already mutual recognitions and multi-stakeholder collaborations going on, which are not necessarily adherence to global standards, but collaborations among standard holders. And all of these things, a lot is happening, a lot is already happening. Our approach can be centered around the statement, what gets measured gets done. So we want to look as IF and ITMF together with ITC at what progress is actually being made by all the different standard holders towards convergence. What is their preparedness to do this? Are they indeed where there are global standards aligning with those? And we want to continually measure that, and in that way keep pressure on the process of convergence. I think with that, we go to the next slide, and I can briefly say how the SCI works. How are we proposing, or how have we set about to create this measurement? We have actually created 4 principles for identifying a standards body level of preparedness for convergence across social requirements. And the good thing was that for each principle, there was a set of measurable ITC criteria, and we'll hear much more about that. The details will be filled in. That best represent the SCI principles that are selected. And what those principles are, you will see. The principles and the associated criteria will be housed within the ITC database, and therefore this measurement, the measurement of preparedness for convergence of standard holders, will be a structural part of the ITC database and will be posted on the ITMF IF's project website. I think that's very important. We're creating a structural instrument. What gets measured gets done. Now, having said that, I would like to pass the word to Mathieu Lamolle of the ITC.
Thank you very much, Matthijs. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join this session and to discuss a little bit about the work that we have been doing here and the contribution of ITC to this project of the ITMF and the IAF. So thank you again for this. So my name is Mathieu. I work with the ITC International Trade Center in Geneva, Switzerland, which is an agency of the United Nations. And I think, Matthijs, what you left here is this timeline of the SCI, and this is where you can also everyone see the connections between ITC's work. So if you don't mind, I will just take it from here and then dive into the standards map. So, you know, what we have discussed with you standards really from a long time ago. I mean, you started the discussion about SCI already at a side session of the OECD forum last year. At that point, you had draft principles, criteria, you called them at the time, around standards convergence. And I just want to also, you know, echo what Gerwin was putting in the chat box. Thanks for your comment and question about what do we call standard fatigue, what is standard convergence, what are we talking about? And this is a good point, because indeed some of the standards look the same in principle. Questionnaires more or less would look the same, but the fatigue element, or let's say the need for convergence, comes when there is an audit process, when there is a kind of interpretation of the findings and looking at potential for organizations to work together, because in the end what matters is actually to transform the industry so that it reaches more sustainable social, labor and environmental goals, rather than just focusing on independent and totally siloed approaches, right? So the question here is about where do we go from an intention that Matthijs and Christian from IAF and ITMF have expressed about a year ago, and that was in Q1 2021, expressing some criteria. How can we see how complicated or how easy it is for a standard to work with others in the same industry? To which extent are standards ready? Not necessarily to merge. That's not what we are saying. It's not about merging. It's not about having one big solution that fits everyone. This is naive. This doesn't work. But where is there that we can identify connecting points between initiatives and standards? And this is the whole point. So from last year, there have been a number of iterations of definitions. And Matthijs, I just want to repeat again one thing important you said. It's about finding a global language and taxonomy, a kind of a harmonized language to discuss about standards and sustainability initiatives, so that there is little room as possible to duplicate efforts when possible, without necessarily removing the uniqueness of different initiatives. So this is very important as well. And we had that in the Q2, Q3 of 2021, when we reviewed the criteria, or at least the aspirational goals of SCI, and on our side at the ITC, trying to make a connection between those criteria, those high-level aspirations, and what is it, the information that we actually do have in our database that could be used for it. So that was the whole refinement of the criteria, shortlisting of indicators from our database, up until a sort of a finalization of those principles for the SCI with the public consultation that was at the end of last year. So trying to be as precise as possible in terms of your objectives of the SCI for assessing standards likelihood and preparedness to work in more efficient ways and, you know, connect the dots wherever they could be connected. And now we are today. So we go to the next slide, and I'll share with you some thinking and thoughts on how ITC has connected its global database of sustainability standards with this project of the IAF and ITMF. So maybe just a helicopter view back, what database do we have at the ITC? So this is it's called the Standards Map database. It's a global public good. It's free of charge. Everyone can access it. It comprises over 300 sustainability standards, not only covering textiles and garment, footwear, but really everything from agriculture to manufactured goods, electronics, textiles, and also services like sustainable tourism. So this is really a big database of codes of conduct, sustainability standards, audit protocols that really are used by industry platforms, or sometimes just by a corporate company, a manufacturer, a brand, or an NGO that would be promoting sustainable practices in a certain region or in a certain sector. And the ITC map, standards map, enables you to identify per country, per sector, per sustainability hotspot, which initiatives exist, and then make some comparisons. ITC does not rank, does not value judge standards saying this one is better than this one. We understand that there are many reasons for all of them to exist. We are there to bring more transparency about what is it that they are doing, in which countries, in which sectors, what are the requirements, what are the modus operandi of the standards. And you're all most welcome to go online and to look at the standards map database. So if we go to the next slide, indeed, it's just a snapshot about how do you navigate the online database of the standards map. Honestly, it is comprised of over 3,000 indicators and data points. So this is overwhelming. If you want to study a certain standard and initiative, you could be overwhelmed with the data. So we have structured it around chapters and pillars. Like in this case, you would be opening up the environment chapter or the social chapter, and then you see there are sub-chapters like human rights and labor rights and local communities, and every time you enter a new folder of the database for any standard of your selection, any initiative, you'd be able to review a number of parameters. What are the issues covered? Migrant workers, overtime, payment of wages, etc. And then those requirements, you would be assessing them per what is a certain timeline to comply. So if the standard and the questionnaire requires something, is it something to be done immediately or at a rather medium term, long term, short term perspective? Is it critical? Is it a major must? I mean, do you have a big issue if you fail on that? Is it really explicit, or is it more like an implicit requirement, something that would be using words that are not explicitly on the topic of, let's say, due diligence, human rights, or is it something that could be indirectly connected? And then the last level of information in the ITC database is the link to the source data. It's the link to the information that is in the standard document with the track record of the website and the sources and everything. So this is what you find in the standards map. And I think the next slide is also showing you a snapshot with the real data. Like in this case, the social chapter, labor rights, criteria on working conditions, and publicly available policies defining the workers' rights. So in this case, for that one standard selected, you would see that this is an immediate major requirement that is explicitly covered, and it ends up with an excerpt of the text. So read the text that comes from the standard document itself, and by even clicking on the more information button, you have a possibility to go directly to the standard website and download the whole information. So 3,000 data points, it's a lot, and it's A to Z from what is it, where are they based, where do they operate, what do they require, how do they implement the verification, the audit process, etc. That is, let's say, the ground field for making multiple types of analysis and even assessments of standards. And this is where SCI and Christian and Matthijs came to us and said, guys, is there a possibility to connect at least some of your indicators from the standards map to those overarching convergence principles that we have in the SCI? And this was the starting point for reflection about, okay, what kind of information could help us to connect a standard to a level of preparedness to converge, or at least a kind of an assessment if the standard operates only in a silo, or if it actually could potentially open up to working with other sustainability standards. I think the next slide, Anne, will actually show that beyond the content of the standard. So the content is everything that goes into the questionnaire, the things that the auditors will be checking. The value of the standards map is that it also goes into the next direction of the how the standard operates, how is it managed, how does the standard ensure traceability of the product, what are the elements that goes into the management of the standard and that ensures its credibility, its openness, its, let's say, working with other initiatives globally. I mean, how does that really work? And this is the second big piece of the database that, of course, was heavily looked at when it comes to SCI principles and indicators. So that was an important one. And yes, the next slide will be just a conclusion on the standards map, because this is only the starting point, let's say, for SCI. For others that are joining us today, if you'd like to just go online, standardsmap.org, you can see those 4 big features of the tool, which are identification of the standard. You select a country, a region, you select an industry or a sector, you select a sustainability topic or a social rights or human rights or things like this, and then you have a list of standards. Then the second feature is about comparisons. So you put the data side by side and you can see, aha, this one standard is mostly social, this one is mostly environmental, those ones cover both, more or less the same questionnaires. But then how does that go into the modus operandi? Then you switch the screen and you look at audit practices, auditor skills, etc. The third module is about the trends, and the trends is market trends. So when you look at the demand for certified products, then you can also assess how quickly the market is taking up on the standards. And then a self-assessment, this is more like for a potential new certified operation, a facility, a company that would like to get certified. They click self-assess and they start filling up a profile. And it's not, of course, certified or validated. It's more like a capacity building to help companies understand where they should improve. So that's the standards map. And I think, Anne, I will probably stop here, because now it's all about connecting that pool of data, that massive pool of data, 300 standards, 3,000 data points per standard. You just made the math and you see how big the database is, and how does that translate into a kind of a specific perspective on convergence likelihood for the standards. And on that work, Anne Wilkins is our consultant. She's been working on this project with me and with Matthijs and Christian over the last months. And so it's a pleasure to have you on the call, Anne, and to present to the others the methodology and the preliminary results. So thanks again, and floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthew. So hello, everybody. And I'm happy to be here today to present the work that we've done so far. So for the side session, we're going to present the SCI principles and criteria. And we're going to show you how we selected the criteria from the ITC database. We will explain the methodology used to compare the standards against the SCI principles and criteria. And then we will be presenting preliminary findings, which will be a comparison of 6 voluntary sustainability standards operating in the garment and footwear sector. I am aware that the term standard doesn't necessarily apply across the board, but just for the point of this side session, that's the terminology I will use. So first, the principles and criteria. So there are 4 principles, and for each principle, we selected categories of criteria that we thought best fit within these principles. So for principle 1, the level of preparedness to harmonize standards. So what's the level of preparedness a standard has to harmonize with other standards? So we looked at the types of criteria surrounding environmental and social management systems and strategies and objectives, taking these elements as important factors in considering harmonization. We looked at stakeholder mapping, engagement, and consultation. We also looked at whether the scheme has been recognized or accredited by other organizations. There's compliance with international norms, best practices, and we also looked at criteria all associated with equality, inclusiveness, and accessibility. So for principle 2, which is alignment with OECD due diligence guidance and ILO standards, these were primarily criteria related to content requirements within a standard document. associated primarily with ILO standards, so the fundamental rights at work, human rights. We're looking at supply chain due diligence, elements associated with the OECD due diligence guidance, so grievance mechanisms, continuous improvements, legality of business operations, such as permits, land, wages. We also looked at criteria related to ethics and impact assessments. So principle 3 is the level of preparedness for sharing audits. So we recognize, the SCI recognizes that there is a need for convergence across conformity assessment process as well, not just requirements within a standard document. So principle 3 looks at things like audit transparency, audit access, requirements for auditors, auditor assessments, as well as quality requirements and accreditation. And then finally, the 4th principle is the level of preparedness to integrate quality assurance oversights. And so this is looking at oversight audits, things like independence of oversight from the conformity assessment body, international accreditations, as well as regional accreditation groups. And we also looked at oversight competency skills and accreditation body memberships. So these were the categories that we put the criteria in when looking for what we felt best fit into each principle, each SCI principle. So this just gives you a little idea of the kinds of, like the process and the kinds of criteria that we selected. So based on the types of criteria that apply to each principle, the ITC Standards Map database was gleaned for the most appropriate criteria that best speak to each SCI principle. Now, the numbers of criteria vary depending on the principle. So principle 2 has the most criteria due to its broad applicability for the OECD due diligence guidance and the ILO standards. And as you can see here too, there's a number of criteria that that cut across both more than just one principle. So for the principle 1 level of preparedness, we see that the first criteria is also appearing in principle 2. So after we developed the principles and the criteria, we had a workshop in the last quarter of 2021 to present the principles and criteria. We explained the objectives and processes, and we opened it up for stakeholder feedback. So I'm going to now go on to the methodology. Now, I know this looks complicated, but bear with me because it's really not that bad. So we applied a weighting methodology to assess the standards against the SCI principles and criteria. And there's 2 parts to this weighting methodology. So we first applied a weighting to the response options associated with each criterion. So criteria within Standards Map have different response options depending on the type of question. So some response options are yes and no, and others are multi-select. So for example, the first criterion shown here under principle 1 has a response option of yes or no, and you can see that right here. The criteria is stakeholder representation in standards decisions. And since stakeholder involvement is a critical element in harmonization, we weighted the yes at 100%, and then the no would be weighted at 0. So multi-select options, as you see in the criteria number 2 here, is weighted depending on the degree of intensity. So as the degree of intensity falls, the weighting becomes less. So the second type criterion here is frequency of standards revisions. So the more frequently a scheme revises its standard, the more quickly it can adapt, improve, and align with other initiatives. So for this example, we weighted the higher frequency at 100% and then the less frequency at 20%, which would be ad hoc here. And so you can see 100% for annual, then every 2 years it drops, every 3 years, every 5 years, etc. Okay, so the second part of the weighting methodology is to do with the level of relevance. So each criterion that we selected.
So yeah, 4 days, 3 meeting rooms, it's the studio.
Can everyone please mute themselves? Thank you. So the second part of the weighting methodology is to do with the level of relevance. So each relevance rating has a level rating of either high at 100%, medium at 80%, or low at 50%. So the first criterion, stakeholder representation in standards decisions, is classified as high relevance because harmonization speaks to collaboration and inclusivity in decision-making. The second criterion is frequency of standards revisions, and we weighted that at a medium. So the more frequent a standard is revised, it has a better opportunity to continuously improve and adapt, which could more easily bring it in alignment with other standards. However, a standard body that revises its standard annually does not necessarily mean it has a high level of preparedness for harmonization. So that's why we assigned it a medium. And then the third criterion here is the example. A scheme is open to all applicants. And we assigned this a relevance weighting of low. Now, this refers to a policy or a requirement for assurance providers to ensure that their applications procedure is non-discriminatory and accessible to all types of applicants. And although this is an important criterion in and of itself, it's not particularly of high relevance when deciding if a standard is well prepared to harmonize with other standards. So therefore, we assigned it a relevance level of low. And so we applied this type of weighting to each criterion selected within each SCI principle. So after we applied this weighting, the two-step weighting, we then calculated the scores. And the scores were calculated in 2 steps. So first, all criteria is scored according to its response rating. So yes, no, or multi-select. And then once all the criteria has its response rating scores, the criteria are scored on their level of relevance. So all the scored criteria that are of high relevance are added together, then multiplied by the high relevance weighting, which in this case is 100%. So all scores remain the same. Likewise, all medium relevance criteria, all scores are all added together, multiplied by the medium relevance weighting at 80%, and then scores are 80% of full strength. Same process for low, so the scores are halved and will be 50% of full strength. The overall percentage is then assigned to each standard. So you can see the formula here down at the bottom. We will make this presentation available to all participants so you can delve into this formula at the end of the side session, but I won't go into it now. So I'm going to now present to you the preliminary findings based on a comparison of 6 standards using the methodology that was just explained above. So as you can see here, we've got principle 1, level of preparedness to harmonize standards. Principle 2, alignment with OECD due diligence guidance and ILO standards. Principle 3, level for preparedness for sharing audits. And principle 4, level of preparedness to integrate quality assurance oversight. And down at the bottom, you'll see here what the color coding means. So if the percentage is highlighted green, that means that the standard has a good preparedness to converge. The overall percent rating for each principle is between 70% and 100%. If it's orange, it shows that some effort is still required with a percentage of 50 to 69%. And then the last is red, which we don't see here on the screen, which means that the standard has much effort still required, and the overall score is between 0% and 49%. And so we've got 6 standards here that we're showing. And as you can see, some standards present a high level of preparedness for convergence for some principles and a lower level for others. So for example, we see Amphori presents a good level of preparedness for harmonization of standards, alignment with OECD due diligence and ILO standards, as well as for sharing audits. However, it drops somewhat for principle 4 and its focus on level of preparedness to integrate quality assurance oversight. Now, it's important to note here that the exercise is designed to promote and instigate dialogue and improve in areas that lead to convergence. It is not an exercise designed to criticize, but rather to incentivize. So based on this methodology that we've developed, any standard in ITC Standards Map can be quickly and easily compared against the SCI criteria. So in conclusion, ITC has created an automatic tool for SCI comparison of any standard operating in the textile and footwear sector that is currently in ITC Standards Map. The comparison informs a standards level of preparedness for harmonization of standard content, alignment with existing international standards and guidelines, for sharing audit outcomes, and for integration of oversight processes. So if a standard body addresses most or all of the selected criteria, then the standard illustrates a propensity for convergence. And the aim is to promote these standards illustrating a propensity for convergence, which will hopefully lead to greater alignment and harmonization of standards and audit and oversight processes. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I'm going to hand things back over to Matthias or Christian for next steps.
Thank you, Anne, and sorry that I dropped out before, but my internet got connected here in the area. So now I'm back on, and I would like to thank for the presentation and for having shared these results. The next steps are that the stakeholder feedback is now compiled. We would like to have now a Q&A session after this presentation to get your first feedback, your first comments, your first critical assessments, and then of course also later on. We will address all these feedback that we will receive today and later on. And we'll work on the methodology to get a final version of the methodology that we have presented today. We can and will need to share that also with the various standard holders, of course, so that they can have a look at the criteria that we chose, and of course also the weighing that we did. That is of course having an influence on the results basically. But since this is not a score to basically say you fail or you don't fail, but rather an encouragement to work on more convergence, this really has to be seen as a dialogue rather than anything else. The user can, as Mathieu has said before, use the ITC Sustainability Map to identify the level of propensity for convergence across standard assessed, and I can only encourage and propose to everyone to have a look at this standards map in more detail, because it's quite a map, as Mathieu referred to, with so many data points, and it will take some time to get familiar and acquainted with it, but it's worthwhile the effort. ITMF and IEF really started this journey to first have an overview of where we stand. So this is the first step. We have the first results, and they seem to look quite good, actually, quite encouraging. And we will do this exercise every once in a while, probably every year, to see whether there is convergence in the preparedness of standard holders to converge and to work on their standards and to align them wherever possible. We will continue, final point, the dialogue and action towards convergence across standards operating in the textile and garment sector, and we'll share, of course, these results with our members to make them familiar with the level of preparedness for convergence, and to also involve them in the discussions and to illustrate and to make these results also known and more transparent to the facilities in our industry. Next step, next slide, I mean. I think that's it. Here are our contact details. We will share the slides later on with all of you that have registered for this side session, and would now open, according to the agenda, the Q&A part of the side session.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. If I can immediately kick off, having looked while you were speaking at the chat, many very good questions, which we'll look at all of them, because that's part of the next steps, as you explained. One I would like to discuss here is somebody says, still a bit confused about how the outcomes of the assessments of standards will actually result in convergence, even if standards score very highly in terms of being having a propensity for convergence. That in itself does not equal actual convergence. That is true. It doesn't always equal that, although it must be said that, as you can see, and if you would dive deeper into the criteria that are connected to the principles, it does also say something about the actual work being done on convergence. Let's put it this way: if very little work is done on convergence by these standard holders, it is difficult to get a high score. And maybe Anne, you can also say something about that. But the other part is that this is work in progress in different ways. As we go along, more criteria will enter the Standards Map database. More criteria will be added to the SCI principles, and also very importantly, this is a tool that allows us to also have a dialogue with the different standard holders, as we have been doing as IEF and ITMF for the past years. And those discussions will, of course, also focus on the actual steps being taken for convergence, and sometimes even looking at how we can play a role in accelerating that. The tool also gives us an instrument to focus on those points in our discussion with the different standards holders that need to focus, because that's where the score is relatively low. So yeah, maybe that answers to that point of, you know, measuring preparedness to convergence is nice, but we want to get to convergence, and how does that work? Maybe Anne or Mathieu or Christine, you'd like to add something to that answer.
I will just quickly add that, yes, I mean, I think you've said it well already. But this is to open up dialogue. This is to get people thinking more about convergence. And in order to start seriously thinking about this, we kind of have to understand where we stand at the moment. I mean, this isn't, you can't look at each criteria and say, well, you know, for frequency of standard revisions, well, if we don't revise our standard, that means that we're not prepared to converge. We're not saying that. We're just trying to select criteria that can best give us an idea of where standards currently stand when it comes to being prepared to converge. Hopefully get the dialogue going, get people thinking about it more, so that we can actually go in this direction. So this assessment doesn't actually determine, you know, convergence or have this actually take place. It's just the starting point where hopefully we can get there in a little bit.
We have Hannah from the OECD who raised her hand.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for holding this very interesting session. And of course, congratulations on your initiative. I think for everyone working not only in the garment sector, but also across sectors, as we're looking at the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct, very much feels the pain you know, that's relayed by businesses and other stakeholders from those sectors about the multitude of different standards and assessments they're kind of the object or victim of. For me, it's very important, though, to underline that what you've said, but what might come out less clear in the slides is that you're looking at, and please correct me if I misunderstood that, but that you're looking at the convergence potential. You're not actually assessing the quality of those initiatives and how well they're doing, and actually ensuring that their, you know, members are living up to their expectations and are carrying out, you know, adequate due diligence or engagement in their supply chains. And then secondly, you haven't, like, this is the potential for convergence, you haven't assessed how well they converge, right? And the reason I'm putting kind of emphasis on that is that what you had in one of the slides and under pillar 2, where you're talking about alignment with the OECD, and then had like different standards underneath in green and orange and red. Given that the OECD alignment assessment is a methodology in its own that's completely different, not looking at convergence, but actually the quality and the level of alignment of initiatives back to the OECD diligence standards, I think just the wording choice is a little tricky for us, because our, like, an alignment assessment of some of those initiatives that you've listed there might come out with quite a different conclusion. And I totally see that you see that, because you've made the point about this being about the readiness for convergence, not kind of the qualitative assessment. But I do wonder if that wording could be confusing for a less kind of expert and detail-oriented reader. So I was just wondering if maybe, you know, and we can definitely talk about that in a more detailed call at another time, but maybe, you know, rethinking that color coding, because it does, you know, seeing an initiative name with the green color coding immediately kind of gives the impression that the initiative is doing great, you know, not only on the convergence side, but that there is a kind of qualitative assessment. Exactly that was the slide, you know, particularly with the numerical score and all of it. So anyways, I think, you know, like, you are clear in your minds that you're looking at something very differently. I'm just a little bit worried about how other people who are less into the detail of the methodology might be misreading this. But yeah, again, very happy to pick that up and at another time with a little bit more time and detail. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. If I may jump in, so Matthew from ITC, thanks for your comment. And very quickly, absolutely agree with you, and you're totally right. This methodology that has been built is not a methodology to assess the quality of the initiatives, nor how well do they already converge. Absolutely not. I mean, this methodology is about looking at the potential that in initiatives would have to converge, would they decide to do so, not necessarily that they will do it. Green score that they should be in theory probably ready to converge. It's not yet that they are doing it. And this is also something that Christian and Matthijs discussed as a potential next step for the SCI. I mean, if you think of it from a dynamic long-term perspective, I mean, the first step was more or less to keep a kind of a status quo. I mean, where are we today? Are standards shaped in a way that they can only work in silo, or are they shaped, developed, and organized in a way that potentially they can work with others, maybe establish some recognition protocols, maybe partly recognize audits of each other, maybe actually fully recognize some parts of the processes of the others, or are they set up in a way that actually cannot work together? So for instance, those international frameworks, like in the chat box, Gerwin was mentioning about APSCA, and of course those initiatives that try to harmonize good practices when it comes to auditors' skills, not again to say that this is the best necessarily initiative in the world, but at least it has the benefit of existing, and by multiple organizations adhering to similar principles, that helps for potentially reduce this kind of siloed approach in the industry. So again, in short, this is not evaluating if M40 is better than RAP or SA1000 as a quality initiative, not at all. And it is not about are they already converging so nicely, yes or no. It's about likelihood, and this will be clarified, if not on the slides right here, at least when the SCI goes public with a short report, which would be ready probably before the end of March. At least those preliminary results would be into a document that will be shared with all of you. Then those nuances will be explained in more detail, and also probably with annexes detailing also the different weightings and the criteria in sake of full transparency of the processes and methodologies. So I just wanted to say that, and I see, Christian, maybe you'd like to say a few more words.
No, I think you put it very nicely. You know, this is the starting point for our industry as a whole to have a better understanding how standard holders are actually prepared. I think preparedness is a nice word that we also chose, I think, in the principles that we have also made public on our on this website to converge, and whether they are willing or not, needs to be seen. But we want to encourage them to do so. That's definitely the objective.
If I can quickly add, yeah. So it's really well said, Mathieu. This is not like some general beauty contest on standards, because we also lack the criteria to measure by what beauty constitutes. But there's a few exceptions, and I think maybe the OECD guidance on due diligence is one of them. And Hannah, you are right. We should look at this carefully. There can be two ways in which this gets done. Either the work of the OECD on the alignment, the existing alignment assessments, and other forms of that finds its way into the ITC Standards Map database, and then there's the connection with our criteria, or this is something that we add on as it goes along. But we're very well aware of the work of OECD in this regard. So good comment. Thanks for that.
Any other comment from anyone? We can either unshare the presentation so we see everyone, and it's easier maybe to unmute, and people feel more encouraged to unmute and ask a question directly to us and to the audience, or just a comment.
Christian, hi.
Hi, Gerwin. Yes, please go ahead.
I put already a couple of comments in the chat, indeed, and we are happy to see that we are green across the board. But you know, from our previous talks, we always look very much at the credibility, and of course we are happy to make next steps. Also a small reminder that we were one of the founders at SLCP at a certain time. But if you are a standard holder who is providing a certificate, you need to be very careful. You cannot be accountable for an audit conducted by somebody else if they don't apply the same quality assurance program. And indeed, the auditor APSCA certified is, I think, a very critical step. So from our side, and I'm just a Europe representative, but Avadis will not say, I think, very different things on this. We are, of course, very interested to go this road and to do what is possible, but I think we should not lose the focus on the downright credibility of the audits on the spot in the factory. And in this respect, I see a lot of room for improvement regarding worker voice and a lot of topics. The groundwork is as important as looking at the data and how can we work together. That we have to work together more closely, that's obvious, and I thank you really all for this initiative. But there's a lot of work to do, but you can count on us. That's what I like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerwin, for this comment. I think Kate also wanted to say something. I just had the impression that it was the case. If not, anybody else? But that's not either not too bad, or it's you or people are overwhelmed. I'm sure you are overwhelmed because it's quite difficult to grasp you know, all the details of the presentation at once, and therefore I fully understand that people will probably look at the presentation again, and then also hopefully at the standards map. Kate, did you want to say something? You were always kind of taking off, so please feel free to take the floor, unmute yourself.
So sorry, I was out for a second there, so I've missed what was just said. The comment on standardization of what happens on what an initiative requires is the process on the ground. I would second that from the RAP speaker. But I would add that the UNGPs, and therefore the laws for business human rights, due diligence and supply chains, at least if you look at the UNGPs, use the words, the voice of the rights holder. And what we've seen increasing initiatives doing is not only does that come through from worker interviews, but also initiatives where you either monitor with trade unions and or check in with trade unions or other worker representative organizations. So if I was looking at an initiative, which I've shared a sort of a demo of my attempt to do, compare initiatives, you know, that, but to the point made by the RAP speaker, apologies, I can't see the name right now. You know, if you're looking at the comparability, how is the effort conducted on the ground, and does it meet these new HRDD expectations, is my point. Does it build in not just that ethics and standard of the auditor, but also a lot more about the rights holder voice coming through as the UNGPs call for, and we're trying to move to a lot more of, as that getting over those issues of past issues with audits that, yes, I've seen many where there was not credibility to them.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I can say, this is indeed a critical issue. That's why it's also in one of the four principles that we defined, and you can also already see how this process works. We start to talk about this. We understand that this is one of the pillars of creating convergence, is being able to agree on the trustworthiness of the flow of information. As I said, the flow of information about the real state of the supply chain. You know, if that information flow is not there, if that the trustworthiness is not there, then it's very difficult to avoid duplication of collecting that information, which is what manufacturers are facing. Yeah, so this is one of the things we need to be talking about, is all of that information in the Standards Map database, or are we missing things there? What are some of the global initiatives, and how can we work together to strengthen those together? And then again, measure that and see what effect that has. It's exactly where we want to go, in short.
That is that we would like to thank you for having joined this meeting, that we will share the documents, that we invite all of you to come back with comments after this session. Please take the time to study the presentation and then to come up with questions, with comments, so that we can include them in the report that is going to be prepared, as Mathieu has said, probably by the end of March, which we will share again with the participants of today's meeting and anybody else. We will probably share it publicly on our website, and we will take it from there. And with that, thank you very much for having joined this meeting, the side session, as it is called correctly. And we wish you all a wonderful day, wonderful end of the OECD forum, and then a wonderful weekend. And please stay with us and share all your concerns and also encouragement. Thank you so much. Thank you, Matthijs. Thank you, Mathieu, and thank you, Anne, for your wonderful presentation.